Welcome back to Morning Joe. Beautiful live picture of the White House coming up on 7:30 in Washington, D.C. on a Tuesday morning. Joining us now, the co-founders of political opposition research firm Fusion GPS, Glenn Simpson and Peter Fritsch. They're out with a new book entitled Crime in Progress, Inside the Steele Dossier and the Fusion GPS Investigation of Donald Trump. And back with us for this conversation, NBC News correspondent covering national security and intelligence, Ken Delaney. Gentlemen, good morning. Good to have you with us. Glenn, let me just start with you. Fusion GPS, the Steele dossier, they've become these buzz terms over the last 3 or 4 years. We heard them come up again in the impeachment inquiry and those open hearings. I just want to go back to the beginning, though, of who hired you during the campaign to look into then candidate Donald Trump in 2015.
Right. Originally, we were retained by a conservative newspaper during the Republican primaries. And it was an intra-Republican competition. So we worked for about 7 months looking into Donald Trump during the Republican primaries. That's important to remember and is detailed at length in the book because the Republican talking points about us now are that this is some kind of Democratic hoax or a Democratic conspiracy. That doesn't make logical sense because the Republicans paid for half of the investigation.
So we're talking about September of 2015. The Washington Free Beacon, a conservative outlet, comes to you. At the time, like many Republicans, opposed Donald Trump and was looking for dirt. When did they stop their association with you, and who picked it up from there?
Well, first, I just correct a little thing. We weren't looking for dirt so much as understanding of who this individual was, his business record. You know, this is the first time a real estate executive has run for president, I think. Doris will correct me.
You are correct.
And, you know, so we actually amassed a lot of evidence of I would call it a sort of a ecosystem of compromise around Donald Trump and people affiliated with the former Soviet Union. You know, people like Felix Sater, who was, you know, a convicted criminal, once stabbed someone in the face with a margarita glass, went to prison for it. You know, and then we saw a poker ring being run by the Russian mob out of Trump Tower, you know, which hosted the likes of Leonardo DiCaprio and Alex Rodriguez. So when you sort of stack a lot of that up, we got to the point where we felt like we needed to know a little bit more. Public records laws aren't so great in Russia, so we turned to Chris Steele.
And that was around the time that we transitioned from a Republican client to a Democratic client.
Which was who?
The Democratic National Committee in the Clinton campaign.
And what point was that? When did that transition happen?
It was around May of 2016.
May of 2016. Guys, Ken Delaney's in Washington with a question for you. Ken?
Yeah, Glenn and Peter, I've always viewed the dossier as raw intelligence. And as you know, raw intelligence can often be wrong in part, but still be very important. And viewed that way, the dossier was an incredibly prescient document about what the Russians were doing. But in terms of what it reported about what the Trump campaign was doing, it seems like, and I want to ask you about this, it got some major things wrong. We all know about the Michael Cohen meeting in Prague. Mueller found that never happened. But not only that, it appears that the Southern District prosecutors found that Michael Cohen was not conspiring with the Russians at all, despite what the dossier saying that he was. The dossier said there was a well-developed conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia. Obviously, Mueller didn't establish that. The dossier said that the Russians had been feeding Trump intelligence for years about Hillary Clinton and others. Mueller failed to establish that. Can you talk about, do you think that Mueller simply couldn't prove some of these things and that they actually may in fact be true? Or what are your thoughts about some of these allegations that haven't proven out?
I think the best metaphor for this is Pearl Harbor. Here was a report, and we have to think about the meta theme of the report, which is that, you know, here was a report that said the Russians are trying to affect the outcome of an American election with the specific goal of electing Donald Trump president. You know, in hindsight, that call, that warning about an attack on Pearl Harbor turned out to be correct. And in light of current events, I think no one can really question whether Donald Trump is capable of inciting a foreign government to help himself. You know, that said, in hindsight, it's sort of like, talking about Pearl Harbor and saying, well, the report got it wrong because you said there was going to be 150 Japanese Zeros and there was only 120. They were going to come in from the north, but they actually came in from the west. Which is just deflects from the bigger point.
Right. And I would also point out that there's a huge distinction between unproven and untrue. And we talk about this a lot in the book. There isn't a long list of things in the dossier that have been disproven. There are many things that have not been resolved as to whether or not they are true.
Can we go back to the root? Who is Christopher Steele? Where did he come from? And why did he have this uniquely piqued interest in Donald Trump?
So we're former journalists. Christopher Steele has been doing Russia his entire life. He is a Russian linguist. He rose through the ranks that served a tour in Russia for MI6, the British intelligence service, and rose to run its Russia desk before he left in 2009. He is one of the preeminent experts in the world on Russia. He and his company Orbis, are also highly trained in the detection of disinformation, right? So he collected a lot around the dossier, but there's a lot he didn't put in there. We don't know what that is because he didn't clear his bar.
Like us, he really didn't know anything about Donald Trump when we first commissioned him to try to figure out why Donald Trump was going to Russia. Donald Trump was a fairly obscure character in his world and ours. So his real expertise is Russia. And Trump just sort of wandered into the middle of something that was going on with Russia, which was that Russia had mounted a huge operation to begin meddling in the politics of Western democracies and attempting to disrupt the NATO alliance, the Atlantic Alliance, the European Union, all of which has been, frighteningly successful.
And just one other point on sort of the investigative hygiene here. It's really important to remember that when we tasked or hired Chris Steele, we didn't tell him who we were working for. He didn't know when he created that first report.
Ken?
Thanks, Willie. Guys, there was a broadly held assumption that Robert Mueller would take a look at whether Donald Trump had prior business relationships with Russian oligarchs, that he would follow the money, that he would get Trump's tax returns and explore relationships that could be seen as compromising once Trump became president. But when the Mueller report was published, it became pretty clear that he didn't do that. And it's not clear to me that the FBI Counterintelligence Division has done that either. You guys have investigated that somewhat. Do you think that's still an open question? What can you tell us about what you know about whether Donald Trump did business with Russians? For example, his son once told a golf writer, allegedly, that the Russian investment financed some golf course purchases that the Trump organization made. Do you think that's still an active and open question?
It's a mystery to us, too. We've seen indicia of some other separate investigation, but it's beneath the waves. So we really just don't know what's going on in the counterintelligence arm of the FBI. Historically, and as you know, counterintelligence investigations don't result usually in criminal charges, so we may never know what they found or what they even looked for. But obviously it was a disappointment to see that Mueller didn't go in this direction, and we were hopeful that Congress would step up and shed some light on this. We still think that's a possibility.
It's also important to remember, Ken, that most of the examples you mentioned deal with evidence that are sitting outside of this country and therefore beyond the reach of Robert Mueller and his team and their subpoena power.
But certainly we saw mountains of evidence, and this is detailed at length in the book, that huge amounts of mystery money from the former Soviet Union flowed through Donald Trump's properties.
Guys, I wonder if you could talk about what Fiona Hill said in her testimony. She was one of the foremost Russia experts on the NSC until she left. And she said that the dossier went down rabbit holes, and she suggested that Christopher Steele was played, suggesting that the Russians may have fed him misinformation to infect the discourse here. How would you respond to what Fiona Hill said?
I mean, we saw that testimony. We've been asked about it. I mean, we would only say that, first of all, Fiona Hill is, as you say, an outstanding Russia expert. We're here to talk about our book, but you should read her book. It's outstanding. She, however, is not an intelligence official. She's not a professional in the detection of things like disinformation. And I don't know that she was able to, well, the Republicans didn't really follow up on that point. So we don't know really what she meant.
A little mystifying as to what she meant by that, but she wasn't in government when all of these events occurred, and when she did go into government, it wasn't her job to look into the accuracy of this. So she's entitled to her opinion, but it's kind of uninformed as to the specifics of what went into the dossier.
As a general rule, Peter, try not to put conspiracy theories out into the atmosphere, but you guys are here to respond to it, so I'll let you. Rudy Giuliani on TV last week saying he has very strong evidence that the Steele dossier, a lot of it was produced in Ukraine. What's your response there?
I mean, I have one word. That's 3 words. That's absolutely false. Glenn has a better story about Rudolph Giuliani, which you might like to hear.
I ran into him on the shuttle from New York to D.C. last week, and got out my phone after we got off the plane, and turned on the recorder and said, "Mr. Giuliani, my name is Glenn Simpson." I introduced myself, and I said, "Would it surprise you if I told you I'd never been to Ukraine in my life?" And he said, "Oh, okay. I guess I'll have to look into that." However, I don't think he's ill-informed, misinformed, or confused. I think he's just not telling the truth. It's just a made-up. It's another made-up story designed to provide cover for Donald Trump.
He is cranking the fog machine.
We have just scratched the surface of the story. The entire story is in the new book, Crime in Progress, Inside the Steele Dossier and the Fusion GPS Investigation of Donald Trump. Glenn Simpson, Peter Fritsch, thank you both. Good to see you.
Thanks, Willie.
Coming up on Morning Joe, as the impeachment probe has ramped up, former U.S. Acting Solicitor General Neil Katyal has been outspoken about making the case against President Trump. Neil joins us to lay out the argument in his new book, Impeach. That's ahead on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.